Hi, I'm Euan Roger. I'm a Principal Medieval Record Specialist at the National Archives, and today I'm going to be taking a look at E122/71/4, which is a customs account from London in the years 1380 to 1381. So it's a particularly interesting account because it was overseen by the poet Geoffrey Chaucer during his time working at the Customs House. Geoffrey Chaucer is perhaps best known to us as the author of the Canterbury Tales, but what you might not know is that he actually had a long career in the medieval civil service, in the Customs House and as Clerk of the Works, as well as being an MP for Kent. So Chaucer had been appointed to the Customs House in 1374, and he was controller, so that meant that he was overseeing the collectors of the customs. So this is all the goods coming in and out of the Port of London, whether that's the wool or what's called the petty customs, which is basically anything other than wool. The collectors would collect the money, and Chaucer would compile his own accounts at the same time, so that when they were audited at the Exchequer, they would match up, or hopefully match up. We don't have any of Chaucer's own accounts, although he would have been required to have been present and to compile records probably with his own hand, but none of those survive, unfortunately. So today we're going to be looking at the collector's accounts to 1380-1, which were overseen by Chaucer. So this is a time in Chaucer's life at the start of his career in what we might call the medieval civil service, when he's also beginning to develop his literary style and write some of his works. So it's quite interesting to think about his day-to-day experiences at the Customs House and the effect that might have had on his writings. He writes in one of his poems that he was going home from his reckonings to work at another book, so we can see how Chaucer's life and literary works can combine. So this is a parchment roll, and it's bound in what's called Exchequer style, which is where the bits of parchment are all bound together at the top, and then they're loose below that. So it's quite difficult to open it up because we've got individual sheets of parchment that are all have been rolled up previously, so it's quite common that they'll ping back out. So we need to essentially roll them up to the top, secure the top of the roll, and then we can open it out and see what the contents are. And we need to use some weight to make sure we secure it at the bottom, as otherwise all these individual sheets can easily ping back up. So at the top of the roll here we can see that it's particulars of accounts by Nicholas Brember and John Philippot. So they're the collectors, and they're also at this point very important men in London society. They're very wealthy merchants. They're both involved in the events of 1381 and the Peasants' Revolt, where they help put down the revolt and they go with the king to Smithfield. So these are very important men who are collecting these customs. And then underneath, you can see that this account has been compiled by the view and the oath of Geoffrey Chaucer, the controller. So this is Brember's and Philippot's account, but Chaucer would have had his own account of the same document to verify in the Exchequer. And what we have is individual entries for ships coming in and out of the Port of London, and then for each of those ships we have the individual merchants who are on that ship or whose goods are on that ship. So we have individuals down the side. We then have the amount of wool. So this is for the wool custom. The amount of wool they're importing or exporting, and then the customs that they're paying on that. And what's particularly interesting in these accounts is we get an idea of who might have been around the Customs House and who Chaucer might have been meeting. Now we can't say for sure that these individual merchants would have been present in each of these accounts. It might have been their goods. But particularly with foreign merchants, it seems likely that they would have been around to keep an eye on their goods and make sure nothing went wrong in the process. And what we have for each of these individual entries and individual merchants is we have whether they are English, in which case you have IND for indigenous, or foreign, so you have AL for alien. And that's because they would have been taxed different amounts depending on whether they were English or aliens. And you can see a wide variety of different names, both in the masters of the ships, so each ship will have who the skipper of that ship is. So you can see lots of variety of names in there, but also lots of different Italian-sounding names in particular. The Italians are very, very much involved in trade with England at this point. But you also get people from Iceland, people from Portugal, all sorts of different places, and you can pick some of that information out in the names. And we know that in this one account alone, for 1 year, we have 228 alien merchants who are trading in the Port of London. So we've also got names here: Antonio Merivale, who's an alien, who appears on several occasions; Petro Gracian, or Gratian, who's an alien; Gerard Beck, John Francis. So there's a huge amount of individuals in this one account. So these are particulars of accounts which give the real detail of exactly what's going on, so individual merchants and individual payments. And we also have the enrolled accounts, which is essentially the totals that are presented in the Exchequer. So where we don't always have these particulars, we will always have the enrolled accounts, but they won't give you that detail, that kind of deep dive into the daily life of the customs house that this document would give you. Which is why it's so nice to have all these individual names. We can really get a snapshot of what's going on in South East London at this point. But one of the names that stands out is the Bodmin account here. We have Africano Petro, so African Peter. So we don't really know much about this man. We know his name's African Peter. We don't know if that's his given name or if that's a descriptive name. If he is from Africa, we don't know where he's from. It's likely that he may have been engaged in trade with as part of the Italian contingent. The fact that he appears in this account points to me to the cosmopolitan nature of London and the Port of London at this point. An environment that Chaucer would have experienced on a daily basis, and it wasn't something worthy of comment. It was he's just another merchant in the records. So this account points to the amount of continental or foreign overseas trade coming to England at this point. And particularly the Italian merchants would have been quite a common sight around London at this time. So it wasn't just Chaucer in this kind of small area that he's encountering these people. They would have gone on to trade around the city. So this document is very much focused about tax revenue that's being brought in, not the individuals. But we can perhaps extrapolate a bit of this experience from what's recorded here. So this account is to do with wool. So this is for the wool custom. There was also the petty custom, and Chaucer was controller of both of them at various times in his career. He was at the customs house for 12 years in total. So he would have seen huge amounts of merchants coming and going. The wool custom is to do with wool, obviously, which is one of England's main trading resources at this time. But the petty customs essentially covers everything else that wasn't covered by this custom. There was also a wool subsidy and a petty subsidy, which were one-off or irregular taxes, but the wool customs and the petty customs took place every year. And we can see here as well, we can see the days that they're actually coming in. So this is the ship of Stephen Gerrard, which was in the port or unloaded on the 7th of November 1380. And you can actually see around the period November to May is the busiest time in the customs house, when you see sometimes about over 30 transactions per month. And Chaucer would have been required to have been involved in those, to assign his seal to the merchant's indenture, which stated they had paid that customs. We do know at some points he appoints a deputy, but because he's protecting the Crown's interest, Chaucer is required to be present in the customs house or around the area and to verify these transactions. And we know that because we have records for when he does appoint a deputy. That's an unusual situation. And the whole area around the customs house, this is essentially the east end of the City of London. And when we talk about the City of London at this time, we are talking about the square mile from Blackfriars in the west to the Tower of London in the east. So we're looking at, in this area, the customs house is essentially next to the Tower of London in the southeast corner of the city on the River Thames. There is a modern customs house, and the medieval customs house would have been just to the east of what is there today. And that whole southeast corner of London at this time is an area which is to do with money. So you've got the Tower of London where the mint is at this time. You've got Chaucer working in the customs house, and he lives in Aldgate. So you can really see Chaucer at this time immersed in the financial community of London, of East London in particular. And some of that, I think, does reflect in his later writings. So we see here African Peter arriving in the Port of London in November 1480, and there are 3 Englishmen's goods on the ship alongside him, and also 5 other alien merchants' goods on that ship. And this isn't the only time he features in this account. He seems to have come to Port of London on more than one occasion to sell or export goods. Unfortunately, the area for the number of goods he's bringing in or exporting has been damaged, but we can find him elsewhere in this role as well. So on the back of this membrane, we actually have 2 more entries for African Peter, both on the 18th of November 1480. So that indicates that he's probably got goods on a number of ships. So whether or not he's personally present, we don't know, we can't say from his account, but we know that he's got a significant amount of wool being transported through the port. So we can see here on the ship of John Double, and he is paying on the 18th of November. In just one transaction alone, he's paying £11, 7 shillings, 2 1/4 pence. So that's equivalent to about £7,000 today, just in tax. So he's clearly a wealthy man who is doing quite a bit of trade in London. So what I think this document tells us, or shows us, is that London in the 14th century was a cosmopolitan place, and you have merchants coming from all over to trade and to sell their goods in London. So while we might not necessarily link the Chaucer of the Canterbury Tales to money, taxation, merchants, selling goods, I think this document in particular shows us his day-to-day lived experience. And while African Peter and Chaucer may not have met face-to-face, we simply don't know, his name would have been known to the poet, in the same way that, for example, John Bennet, the Englishman's name, would have been known to him. And this is a really interesting thing to think about at a time where Chaucer is really beginning to start out his literary journey. This is several years before the Canterbury Tales will be written, but this gives us an insight into what the man who wrote the Canterbury Tales experienced in his daily life.